We are traversing one of capitalism's biggest crises since the Great Depression. We're seeing the imperial tactics of the USA abroad boomerang back into the imperial core with unfathomable state-sanctioned violence. Reactionary nationalism is taking hold of electoral politics in Quebec, and the masses are quickly getting riled up in a bunch of successive movementist trends without a clear direction to crush the bourgeois state apparatus. Years have gone by with a constant dismantling of the labor rights and social safety nets that workers have fought so hard to gain from this capitalist state. The only thing protecting those rights and social safety nets in the last century was the looming threat of the USSR and the communist boogeyman that will make us all use the communal toothbrush and send Stalin to eat all our grain with a comically large spoon if we don't give our citizens healthcare and parental benefits or something. But now, well, since 1991, since the USSR has been illegally destroyed by the Yeltsin clique of capitalist schools, the era of reform and social democracy are over. We must act in an organized manner to not only solve the inherent antagonisms of capitalism, but also to avert a looming climate crisis. As Albert Einstein put it, the profit motive of a capitalist society, paired with competition among capitalists, leads to unnecessary cycles of booms and depressions and ultimately encourages selfishness instead of mutual aid cooperation. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented toward social goals. This is from Albert Einstein's Why Socialism, a small essay written in May 1949. But first, what even is socialism? It is vital to the goal of this video to differentiate socialism, communism, and Marxism. These are all intertwined and not mutually exclusive, and the notions given here are quite simplified, and I strongly suggest you read the following works: The Principles of Communism by Friedrich Engels, The Three Sources and Three Components of Marxism by V.I. Lenin, and Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Engels. All three are available online on the Marxist Internet Archive. First, Marxism is a tool that enables us to analyze and understand the world around us as well as the development of societies through a materialist lens. What does this mean? It means that our consciousness is separate from the matter, and that the matter, the material world, precedes thought and ideas. This is in stark contrast to the idealist dialectics of Hegel, who, along with pretty much every idealist before and after, believes that ideas influence the material world first and foremost. Marxism makes use of historical and dialectical materialism to explain the rise, development, and or fall of certain economic systems, as well as the contradictions within them that cause these developments, notably and most importantly within the capitalist system. It is also a critique of capitalist political economy, a theory of scientific socialism, opposed to the idealist utopians that preceded Marx. And for that, I suggest you take a look at Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Engels, or to the broader work containing this essay, entitled Herdering's Revolution in Science, which is a great work that dives very deeply into scientific socialism. And then, by extension, Marxism-Leninism is Marxism applied to the era of imperialism, and theories on revolution, the vanguard party, and the national question. Again, good reading recommendations for understanding Leninism are What is to be Done, The State in Revolution, and Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, all by V.I. Lenin. Then, socialism as described in Marxism is a stage of historical social economic development where the organization of the armed proletariat has seized state power, crushed the bourgeois state, and established a transitional mode of production, socialism, where the proletariat collectively own the means of production through a council-based state, which provides free healthcare, housing, schooling, public transportation, and most notable of all, organizes labor and production to follow an economic plan in a way that's rational, not wasteful, and environmentally friendly. And the 21st century adaptation of this economy was described by Paul Cockshott. Now, this economy is a direct democratic, centrally planned economy based on computers. Again, it is a transitional period to high-stage communism involving a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the armed workers suppress the resistance of the bourgeois, the oppressor capitalists, the reactionaries, the Nazis, the fascists, and the imperialists, where there is the collectivization of farms, factories, and other places of work. And obviously there's been like very many real-life applications and interpretations of socialism with varying levels of successful accomplishments. Today they have either been completely destroyed by Western intervention, and the other part of the socialist experiments, aka China, Vietnam, Laos, the DPRK, gave way to a lot of market reforms, thanks to entryism by bourgeois capitalists, sanctions, or simply due to revisionism or other factors. This is not really an analysis. I can make another longer video on this subject. The most notable work that dives into this is Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. May he rest in peace. Marx never himself distinguished socialism from communism, rather using lower and higher stage communism as stages of historical development to describe the development of a communist society. So at the time of Marx, there were only really utopian socialists who believed in More's like insane socialist utopia, who wanted like immediate abolition of the state. We were looking at like either social democrats, anarchists, or like very misguided idealists. So at the time, only utopian socialists existed who based their entire worldview on moralist principles rather than materialist analysis. To reiterate, Lenin then expanded on Marx's ideas and described socialism as the transitory stage to achieve communism, where workers have seized state power through a revolution, crushed the bourgeois state apparatus, and have established a dictatorship of the proletariat. A worker democracy with a planned economy where the proletariat is the ruling class. The development of socialism will be further described later. Finally, communism refers to high-stage socialism, when the political state withers away to give place to a solely administrative function and is no longer necessary, when workers observe the development of society without fear of a tyrannical bureaucrat state or restoration of capitalism. Money as we know it is abolished in favor of labor time accounting or a gift economy. We don't really know what communism looks like, purely speculative, because it has not been reached anywhere and it cannot be reached anywhere while the capitalist world order is still holding strong. Under high-stage communism, classes are fully abolished, and there is no longer a worker-bourgeois antagonism necessitating a political state to suppress the bourgeois elements, and thus negating the dictatorship of the proletariat. So to reiterate, communism is the end goal, society organized horizontally, made of worker councils without a political state, governed by the masses. Again, it's not something achievable right away, and no communist thinks that unless they're an idealist or an anarchist or straight up reject scientific socialism. It will take many, many years, decades, even maybe centuries before rising, and even more if we're going 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as Lenin put it, with threats of capitalist restoration and people being deluded with external market forces. And again, more on this and capitalist restoration in past socialist countries is very well put by Michael Parenti. I've left a link in the description to the audiobook by Socialism for All, and from there you can find the archived work if you want to read it online. So, this seems great, but how do we achieve it? Well, let's settle down and observe the ways to achieve this society by analyzing the works of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Luxemburg. First and foremost, the way of achieving socialism varies a lot depending on who you may ask and which place in the world is in question. Material conditions and the stage of development vary greatly from country to country. So in the global south, there are insurgent worker revolutions like in India and the Philippines, where the armed proletariat and guerrilla struggles are fighting actively against the capitalist state, but they are very much suppressed. Many struggles have happened with different methods, different levels of success, material conditions, vanguard parties, guiding lines. But this video is mainly addressed at the Western left, living in either settler colonial states or elsewhere in the imperial core. I think it is erroneous to fall into the trap of third worldism. I guess my main gripe with it is that it is a sentiment of cynicism for our working class. I think it is our duty to organize together and to crush this bourgeois state apparatus. Otherwise, this third worldist position just negates any action. So how do we reach socialism? Well, it's not simply an immediate workers' revolution with no one to guide it, or parliamentary reform, aka voting in someone every 4 years to do the work for us, and realizing that we've elected a reactionary conservative instead of a mild social democrat. We must first form strong communities, practice mutual aid, and spread class consciousness in our worker unions and our communities. What we've seen so far from electoralism, running in elections and building a socialist party in a legal system, is definitely a slide back to the right every time we don't seem acceptable to the ruling class. A great example of this is Québec Solidaire in Quebec, that started with many Marxists among them, but what we've seen is a complete negation of socialism, communism, Marxism, or the class struggle altogether for a social democratic class collaborationist approach, which is now sliding back into nationalism rather than actual social reforms. As Audre Lorde said, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." Lenin expanded on this notion by saying that if the state is a product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms, if it is a power standing above society and alienating itself from it, it is clear that the liberation of the people is impossible without a revolution and the destruction of the state apparatus which was created by the ruling class and is the embodiment of this alienation. Regarding reform or revolution, we could also further examine the critique of the Gotha Programme by Marx as a defense of a revolutionary project within the United Workers' Party of Germany, explaining the dictatorship of the proletariat, the transitional stage, the phases of communist society, the production and distribution of social goods, and so on. This is part of a broader analysis taken from my friend Parker, who wrote a pretty insightful document on the matter a number of years ago. If you are already convinced or don't want to go through an in-depth analysis, feel free to skip to the chapter on what is to be done in the next timestamp. We have radical liberals and quote-unquote socialists whose only political project is to alter the distribution of goods and resources, while rejecting the claim that people need to hold power over the means of production, to hold state and factory power. That's where these issues originate. People like this spend all their time focusing on bourgeois democracy, electoralism, voting in away fascism, and voting in people who are going to do significant reforms, which never gets them anywhere and recycles history over and over again, simply for so-called progressives who then betray them. I'm looking very specifically at John Fetterman here. These people are either liberals or utopians who think they can push a neo-lib further to the left. They don't understand a thing about capitalism's modern functions and haven't read any theory. These people reject all forms of violence altogether, equating someone beating a worker to death to the worker then retaliating by seizing state power. These are the same people who believe that Nelson Mandela was peaceful, meanwhile there were actual guerrilla struggles in South Africa. The same people who put Gandhi up on a pedestal by pretending he was the head of this peaceful movement, while there were very active guerrilla movements in India against this colonial, genocidal, British mandated state. Forgetting that Gandhi was a pedophile and a fucking weirdo, that's besides the point. Marx shows us that social democracies can never be efficient and that distribution will always be tied to the dominant mode of production. To move to socialism, a confrontation with the ruling class and their property is a must. The working class strives for its emancipation first within the framework of the present-day national states, conscious that the necessary results of its efforts, which are common to the workers of all civilized countries, will be the international brotherhood of peoples. This sentiment in nationalism opposes the manifesto and all forms of socialism. It conflates the necessity of fighting first at home with the sufficiency of fighting at home. Right? Workers of the world, unite. It is self-evident that to be able to fight at all, the working class must organize itself at home as a class, and that its own country is the immediate area of the struggle. Insofar as the class struggle is national, not in substance, but as the Communist Manifesto says, in form. For instance, the German Empire is itself, in its turn, economically within the framework of the world market, politically within the framework of the system of states. Every businessman knows that German trade is at the same time foreign trade. And the greatness of Herr Bismarck consists, to be sure, precisely in his pursuing a kind of international policy. And this view is too narrow. It reduces proletarian internationalism to a near consciousness that the result of its efforts will be the international brotherhood of all people. It does nothing to lay out the international functions of the German working class, instead adding awareness and suggesting a future brotherhood. This stands below the bourgeois brotherhood, as the bourgeois class also assert that their efforts will be an international brotherhood of all people. The United German Workers' Party, in order to pave the way to the solution of this social question, demands the establishment of producers' cooperatives, cooperative societies with state aid under the democratic control of the toiling people. The producers' cooperative societies are to be called into being for industry and agriculture on such a scale that the socialist organization of the total labor will arise from them. This is insane Proudhonist shit. The program fails to understand revolutionary needs. Instead of arising from the revolutionary process of transformation of society, the socialist organization of the total labor arises from the state aid that the state gives to the producers' cooperative societies, and which the state, not the workers, call into being. It is worthy of Lassalle's imagination that with state loans, one can build a new society just as well as a new railway. And this really exemplifies social democrats' failed views of the state. They view it not as a form of bourgeois control, but rather an entity that can be manipulated by any classes that's stronger. The Gotha Programme ends up calling for government-funded cooperatives, and then says these co-ops can in some way abolish capitalism and capitalist social relations by maintaining markets and free trade with other capitalist countries. This is not the organized proletariat, but rather the impartial state. If the toiling people make demands to the state, there is an inherent concession that the state rules not the toiling people, hence there is no way to create power for the masses since they need to rely on the state to organize more and move on. Marx doesn't reject co-ops and says that the workers' desire to establish the conditions of co-op production on a social scale, and first of all on a national scale, in their own country only means that they are working to revolutionize the present conditions of production and has nothing in common with the foundation of co-op societies with state aid. Henceforth, under the Social Democrat program, the control is sanctioned by and achieved by a state that is not a friend of the people. But as far as the present cooperative societies are concerned, they are of value only insofar as they are independent creations of the workers. There might be room for developing co-ops, but it cannot be funded by the state and has to be created by the workers as a mass movement. Marx argues that the Social Democrats misunderstand the function and role of the state because they treat the state as a reconciler of class antagonisms, as an independent, impartial entity that possesses its own intellectual, ethical, and libertarian basis. Right? The view of Social Democrats is that the state is to be impartial and mediate the conflicts between workers and the capitalists by providing social programs. The state for Marx is not an independent rule, but is an identity expressing class rule and conflict. It cannot express itself free from class rule, but rather as a representation of it. And the state has to exist to represent the class conflict. The current bourgeois state can be contrasted with a future state where the bourgeois state has been crushed and where capitalism withers away. Marx explains there must be a communist capitalist phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He says that the program does not note the stage of development or state features that will develop under communism, but rather reiterates bourgeois rights, right? These idealist natural rights to property that Proudhon talked about and that Marx slimed him for. And because the party wants to work with the state, the demands are mainly pointless because at the time Germany was an empire without a liberal democracy. This may have made sense in the different framework to expand the democratic republic, but not for the left. And if you're to work in a bourgeois liberal democracy, you are going to get suppressed for making demands that, in the end, have the goal of suppressing the bourgeoisie and suppressing this bourgeois parliamentary democracy. And then there's also the question of workplace democracy as a concept. You've probably seen Richard Wolff talk about it. He calls himself a Marxist and then negates Marx's analysis of workplace democracy. He's like a co-op socialist, whatever. So workplace democracy fails to address all of the main issues of capitalism and hence cannot be a valid solution to dismantle oppression. This is why syndicalism is not a viable method of organizing, because like worker unions don't involve crushing state power. So between capitalism and communism obviously lies a transition state of revolutionary movements where we have a dictatorship of the proletariat. So our biggest conclusions from this are that first, a revolutionary program needs to be specific in its material demands. Second, with the sociological base and superstructure, you can't keep the production capitalist while improving consumption to help the workers. Third, because without having the state power in the hands of the workers, changes in distribution and consumption are subject to be rolled back. Fourth, we need to be incredibly careful, think purposely and tactically and critically. So then what are the applications of this work? Marx deals with the fact that scientific socialism is built out of capitalism. Socialism isn't about burning everything down and starting over, but reviving and fixing the current society in a scientific, revolutionary manner. Socialism is a stage of development. There's not an instant transformation. Socialists both face the question on how to deal with the capitalist nature of society and had to adapt some capitalist fractions to survive and even evolve out of it. Same applies to Cuba and Vietnam and the People's Republic of China. They need to fight with the lingerings of capitalism and the new emerging capitalism. First of all, Enver Hoxha talked about the People's Republic of China as not a proletarian movement, but a peasant and bourgeois alliance that went through a new democratic revolution and then held onto elements of Marxism that negated the class struggle. We have a kind of social democracy with a strong state, but where billionaires have party status, and China has descended into very, very incredible market reforms. Will they change their path and go towards a planned socialist transition towards communism without states, without classes? I personally don't think so, but we don't know. This is something Parenti talked about in Blackshirts and Reds. Significant problems with a lasting class struggle going through several generations. Without an intensification of it, with gradual market reforms and opening up to the markets and sliding back into capitalist restoration. But yeah, capitalism is a starting point, a necessary starting point at that, because we need to have the productive forces necessary to build socialism. Then Marx has a critique of nationalism, that proletarian internationalism is essential. Class struggle starts in the nation state, but we need to link up materially with other class struggles across the globe. Otherwise, we're in a constant state of siege socialism. So capitalist is already imperialist, internationalist in its global trade, so we must be too. The bourgeois nation state is an obstacle. Socialism must be a transition. To suggest otherwise is utopian and will fail because it is ideology. Pure ideology, like Zizek says. So all in all, this is why we need a revolution. This is why we need socialism as a transition toward communism instead of communism as an immediate abolition of the state. Now, how do we do revolution? Well, something that Lenin expanded upon in What Is to Be Done is that there are frequent moments of spontaneity of the masses whenever dramatic events occur. Talk about anti-war peace protests like in the 60s with the Vietnam War, general strikes like we've seen in the general strike in Minnesota today, like this very day, which was called like 3 days before happening. But yeah, we must not fall into this trap of like endless movementism that always fizzles out and benefits the bourgeoisie by not threatening the system with an organized proletariat. Because disorganized and without directions, these spontaneous movements fizzle out and fail, crushed by the state thugs. As Lenin put it, the struggle must be organized according to all the rules of the art, by people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity. The fact that the masses are spontaneously being drawn into the movement does not make the organization of the struggle less necessary. On the contrary, it makes it more necessary. This is from The Primitiveness of the Economists and the Organization of the Revolutionaries, 1901, Lenin. But what does this mean? It means that the class-conscious part of the working class must dedicate themselves to the struggle, read up on the literature, the classics of Marxism and Leninism, investigate class relations and revolutionary doctrine. Professionally engaged in this sense is not like a clique of full-time revolutionaries that are going to seize power and become bureaucrats and be like privileged members of the party. No. It means being principled, truly believing in the movement, and evidently act in a professional manner inside the party. It is important to combat opportunist tendencies, reaction, adventurism, and other unprofessional tendencies. But again, this idea of professionalism isn't a thing at all. It's just a question of knowing what to do, being knowledgeable, and being able to guide the masses in a given direction. Then he says, in the beginning we had to teach the workers the ABC, both in literal and the figurative senses. Now the standard of political literacy has risen so gigantically that we can and should concentrate all our efforts on the more direct social democratic principles and objectives aimed at giving an organized direction to the revolutionary stream. This is from Lenin, New Tasks and New Forces, 1905. And this is a very important part of Lenin's writings. So the Vanguard Party, aka the most class-conscious section of the working class, is not a secretive, subversive clique of 5 individuals seeking to overthrow the system in like a hidden coup or military junta. The Bolsheviks in the beginnings of the USSR were comprised of upwards of 200,000 of these advanced class-conscious sections of the working class. We must educate and train the masses to crush the state apparatus and establish a dictatorship of the workers over the bourgeoisie in a transitional stage towards communism. And this in the settler imperial nations must be a struggle waged shoulder to shoulder with the indigenous nations who were colonized by our ancestors in a manner which promotes their struggle as proletariat. For the time to decolonize is well past its necessity, and we absolutely need to be strong accomplices to the indigenous struggles, to organize to destroy the bourgeois state, to help the cultural revival of our local indigenous comrades, notably here in Quebec, the Inuit language, the Anishinaabe language, the Atikamekw languages, and the arts, the modes of governance. True decolonization removes the privilege of the settlers and the bourgeois, putting everyone on a shared standing of equality, removing this native settler distinctions, and negating the capitalist elements in society, giving rise to a union of nations that are free to associate however they want. So the bulk of this work as class-conscious workers is thus to find a principal Marxist-Leninist organization, to read up on important materials, spread class consciousness, and most important of all, have the capacity to be a directing line to the spontaneous workers when the time arrives. Inside the party, there must be a struggle waged against revisionism, opportunism, and reaction, and bad analysis, and other bad tendencies. At the same time, go to protests, talk to people about class and capitalism, spread the word, and stop engaging in like mindless internet arguments and pretending that you have some sort of new revolutionary theory. And I strongly recommend everyone stop falling into the trap of trying to synthesize your own ideology. If you look at my first video, it was some kind of like Marxist-Leninist Luxemburgist with banning single-use plastics kind of stuff, but really the bulk of the work here is to organize the proletariat, to crush the bourgeois state. And again, one of the most insightful works you can read on this is Blackshirts and the Reds by Michael Parenti.